Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. I'm SocietySucks and today I'm checking out why didn't the US focus on Japan first in World War II by History Matters. Now, I don't really understand this. I thought the US focused on Japan from the very beginning. I mean, the United States only entered the Second World War once Japan attacked them. So, I don't really get it. Hopefully they explain what they mean by this.
When Japan launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, it wasn't too surprising that the US would fight back. And when the Germans and the Italians, in an act of near unbelievable silliness, also declared war on the US,
yeah, they totally didn't have to do that.
To fight them too. But in spite of the fact that Berlin and Rome hadn't actually attacked them, the Americans opted to focus their attention on them first, in what's called the Europe First strategy. But given the shock and damage that the Japanese caused on December the 7th and the immense public fury that followed, why didn't the United States focus its energies on defeating Japan and avenging Pearl Harbor? Why did the US choose to finish Italy and Germany off first? So as you'll all know, Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was a shock to the American people. It near instantaneously reversed the anti-war isolationist attitudes and replaced them with a Japan's population is much too high one. And it won't shock you to learn that the American people, politicians and especially military all wanted revenge. President Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war, which passed unanimously, providing you ignore the one congresswoman who voted against it. With this done, the US was free to focus its incredible power and resources on the country that had wronged it. But before this could begin, the Germans and Italians declared war on the United States. Now, whilst the US was obviously free to ignore Italy, the problem was now that Germany was able to sink US shipping to
that's
Europe.
True. That is true.
Did it. This meant that the US Navy now had a battle to win in the Atlantic alongside the one in the Pacific, which obviously meant that resources would have to be divided between the two. Now, it wasn't a secret that President Franklin D. Roosevelt was sympathetic to the Allied cause, and had wanted to help Britain as much as he could get away with. Much of this was because he saw the Germans as the greatest long-term threat to the United States, and he believed that if they were allowed to dominate the European continent, it wouldn't be long until Berlin would start interfering in the Americas. And
they definitely would have, yeah.
Pose a threat to the American mainland, especially if it had help from Japan. With America now in the war fully,
I mean,
British
didn't Hitler,
Churchill was quick to travel
try to get Mexico into the war? Or was that World War I?
Agreed to do was create a
okay, never mind, I just checked, it was World War I.
Unified command structure and share important technology. Something that the Axis didn't feel the need to do, but I'm sure that will work out fine. Now, the big sticking point was which theatre would be prioritised by the Americans during the war. Obviously, the British were very focused on the Germans, because they were an existential threat to the home islands. And Churchill found an ally in most of the US
How were the British even supposed to focus on the Japanese?
It was obviously going to be a land-focused campaign which would allow them to do the most work. Whereas against Japan, there wasn't as much scope for large-scale land-based warfare, and many in the army worried that they would be second to the Navy, because inter-service rivalry was also a thing in the US. However, it was nothing compared to the absolute hate fest that was the Japanese army and Japanese Navy's.
Why would there be inter-service rivalry? I mean, for fuck's sake, you're going to war where you will most likely die.
Relationship. Obviously, most of the US Navy wanted their Japanese counterparts to get an all-expenses-paid trip to the seafloor, and so just wanted to hold off the Germans in the Atlantic whilst they did this. Now, this meeting between the British and the Americans only came about a few weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and so emotions were still running high. Churchill, though, was able to get most of what he wanted at this meeting by convincing the Americans of a few things. He argued that unlike Japan, Germany was an existential threat to Moscow and London, and that there was no way of knowing how long the USSR could hold out against the ongoing German invasion. And that, if the US didn't focus on clearing the Atlantic and then sending supplies to the Soviet Union, then it could potentially lose fairly soon. If that were to happen, then the Germans would then be free to turn their full attention to the British, and Churchill wasn't able to guarantee that Britain would be able to resist such an onslaught. And if Britain fell, or at least made peace, then there would be no way of dislodging the Germans
Europe is pretty much done at that point,
thereby presenting a much greater long-term threat to the US. Whereas, if the US focused on Germany immediately, then it would be able to guarantee that Britain and the Soviet Union would keep fighting. And then once the
Japanese were outmatched by the US
could focus on helping with Japan.
The US Navy was much more powerful than the Japanese one. Really, when you think about it, Germany was the bigger threat. And Italy, I guess. Let's be honest, who cares about Italy? They weren't that great in World War II. It was all about Germany. Pretty sure if the Germans succeeded in World War II and took over both Britain and the USSR, they would have annexed Italy at some point. Like, that's almost guaranteed.
Which naturally wouldn't be able to resist all three. Now, some in the US military weren't convinced and believed that Britain wasn't being proactive enough against the Germans. US General George Marshall argued that the British army hadn't performed very well up until this point, and that Britain wasn't doing enough to prepare for a major invasion of the continent, and that the British were simply expecting American soldiers to do a lot of the fighting and dying to save them. He was willing to support a Europe-first approach, providing that the Allies launched an invasion of Europe in early 1942. He was soon told to be quiet because such a plan wasn't possible, because neither Britain nor America could build up the troops or equipment quick enough to invade, let alone do it successfully. As such, Churchill and Roosevelt agreed on a sort of compromise. Instead of having American soldiers sitting in Britain waiting for 4 years, they would invade Africa. This would divert resources from Germany and also the other one, thus relieving the pressure on the USSR.
The other one.
Once North Africa was subdued, the Allies would then be free to attack the soft underbelly of Europe, either going through Italy. Or the Balkans. Also, by landing in Africa, it would act as a major deterrent to Spain to keep them out of the war, which was a nice added bonus. For those in the Destroy Japan camp, this wasn't really good enough. They believed that Germany only posed a short-term threat to American shipping. Whereas, if Japan was allowed to run roughshod all over the Pacific, they would gain valuable resources, would be able to entrench themselves, and could make it impossible for the Americans to counterattack by depriving them of staging areas. However, one thing working against the Japan First proponents was the previous war plans that the US had been working on since the 1930s. These were the famous Rainbow Plans, there to prepare the United States for a range of conflicts against numerous coalitions of opponents. One such plan was Rainbow 5, which assumed that the US would fight a war against Germany, Japan and Italy whilst it was allied with Britain and France. Britain would help on the seas and France,
well, would you look at that?
would hold the Germans off on the continent. This plan called for the US to use its navy to secure the Atlantic first, build up the army to the previous Germany crushing levels deployed in World War I, and then, after clearing Europe, smashing Japan. And as you'll know, barring the France bit, it was pretty accurate in predicting what said conflict would look like. With that in mind, both nations agreed on a plan to stall Japanese expansion whilst Germany was dealt with. The first was that Britain, the US, Australia and the Dutch government in exile would unify their command in Southeast Asia. The plan was to create what was called the Malay Barrier. This was supposed to be an impenetrable defensive line which would stop the Japanese advance, thereby saving India and Australia as well as depriving Tokyo of the region's resources.
Didn't the Japanese almost get to Australia?
Didn't work. There was also an agreement that Britain would increase its military commitment to East Asia. And furthermore, both nations pledged to do more to supply the Chinese to keep them in the fight and tie up Japanese resources. Roosevelt ultimately had the last say, and whilst he wanted Britain to stay in the war, he wasn't a fool. He had already secured numerous concessions from Churchill throughout 1940 and 1941. And he believed that even if Britain didn't lose the war, its days as an international superpower were over, meaning that it, along with Japan and Germany, would no longer be able to potentially threaten the US, which is another one of the reasons that he agreed to Europe first, or more accurately a Germany first approach. Now of course you'd think that once this was agreed, the Americans would follow said plan, but fun fact, no.
They didn't.
You see, the agreement between Roosevelt and Churchill was that the US would stall Japanese expansion. But to the leaders of the Navy, that was up to interpretation. The United States built up an incredible number of ships to take the fight to Japan and also built up much larger ground forces in the region. And in the following year, the US Navy was able to inflict numerous crushing defeats on the Japanese Navy. And the first American offensive didn't occur on the other side of the Atlantic, but at Guadalcanal. And despite the fact that the US had agreed to a Europe-first approach, the Pacific War took up most of Washington's resources until late 1943.
Exactly.
It was only in the lead up to D-Day that the US massively increased its prioritization of Germany over Japan. Much of this was due to the fact that in Europe the Soviets were doing the majority of the fighting. And had they not been involved, then the US almost certainly would have needed to massively increase its commitments to Europe. As you'll know, the Germans would surrender first. But before the US, Soviet Union and the British Empire were able to fully turn their attention to Japan after this, it too would unconditionally surrender, because reasons. In the end, the
because of nukes.
Population and military know-how was so great that it had more than enough of each to destroy the Axis powers under the current conditions, whilst also supplying its allies to help them do the same. The Europe First strategy was never about America's survival, but simply about efficiently allocating resources and making sure that American lives wouldn't be needlessly wasted. This meant stalling Japan before it could entrench and propping up Britain and the USSR so Germany couldn't later do the same.
Didn't the US only lose like 800,000 people?
Strategy existed largely
including soldiers and civilians?
It placated the British by lessening the German threat to the British Isles directly. And importantly, it did nothing.
Not saying that 800,000 isn't a lot, but compared to the amount of lives lost in Europe and Asia, 800,000 is very low. Do you know how many millions of people were slaughtered in Asia and Europe? When you look at those numbers and you compare the amount that the US lost in World War II, the US can't really talk about losses. Like, come on. Their losses are minimal compared to everybody else.
To stop the US Navy, Marines and Army from taking the fight to the Japanese, which the American people wanted above all else.
Oh no, I just checked. Apparently the US only suffered a little over 400,000 losses, which is half of what I expected. I thought it was at least 800,000, but no, it wasn't even that much. 400,000! That's really nothing when you think about it. Don't get me wrong, it's a big number, but compared to everybody else, they definitely had the lowest losses. Although, I mean, then again, the US was mostly fighting in Western Europe, Normandy, and the Pacific. So, yeah, I guess that kind of explains why their losses were so low. The majority of the numbers were in Eastern Europe and in mainland Asia, the Japanese and the Chinese. Yeah, a lot of people died there. The Japanese kind of deserved the nukes. They had it coming. But what they did to the Chinese, definitely deserved. So yeah, the US technically didn't focus on Japan first, but I mean, they really did. They allocated most of their resources to fight in the Pacific. At least that's where they fought the most. I've been throwing a lot of shit on the Americans in this video. That's mainly because the amount of times I've seen some idiotic Americans claim that they're the reason World War II was won, it just pisses me off because some Americans, the fact that they have the audacity to even say that is ridiculous. It's just one of the many reasons why I hate the US. Well, okay, I don't hate all Americans, just a decent portion of them. No offense to the Americans watching, but a lot of the people in your country are arrogant fucks. Anyway, I'm ending it here. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. If you want to see more reactions, check out this video right here. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.